Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We're the place you come to when you want to really get under the skin of fascinating topics. We dig through the research, the best sources we can find, and, well, we try to make sense of it all, make it understandable, maybe even insightful.
That's the goal.
And today, wow, we're tackling something huge, a really crucial area of human psychology, social behavior. It's identity. The whole concept of identity and how it connects really deeply connects to group dynamics.
Yeah, it's fundamental.
Okay, let's unpack this then. The source material we're diving into today, it's pretty courageous. It looks squarely at some really challenging stuff. We're talking about extreme group violence, even touching on genocide.
Heavy topics, for sure.
Right, heavy.
Yeah.
And I know that might sound maybe a bit much, maybe even far removed from your day-to-day, especially thinking about you, our listener. Maybe you're that elementary education major just getting into identity and psychology.
Yeah, it could seem like a big leap from, say, classroom dynamics to genocide.
Exactly. But that's precisely why we tailored this deep dive this way. Because while the big historical examples in the source are, severe, heartbreaking, the actual psychological processes, the social things happening underneath, they're universal.
They really are.
They don't just pop up in extreme situations. They have huge implications for understanding just, everyday interactions, how kids make friends on the playground, how those friendships sometimes fall apart, how a classroom builds that feeling of us, or struggles with cliques and division. These are the dynamics you'll be navigating.
Instantly.
So our mission today, it's pretty clear. We want to pull out the core insights. How does identity shape how we see ourselves, how we see others? What are the steps that can lead, unfortunately, to division, even conflict? And crucially, how can we understand these things, resist them, maybe even channel them constructively, especially thinking about kids, early social development?
It's about giving you the tools, the understanding.
Exactly. Knowledge to build empathy, understanding, and hopefully really inclusive spaces.
Yeah, and the source we're digging into sets this up really well. It makes the case that identity is kind of the bridge concept. It links psychology, the individual mind, with sociology, the broader group structures.
Like a theoretical superglue.
Yeah, something like that. It connects different levels of explanation. You need that when you're trying to understand something as complicated as group violence. You can't just look at individual minds, right?
Right. It's not just one person acting alone.
But you also can't just look at big societal forces. Identity is the key, the source argues. That connects the individual choices and feelings to the group actions. Gives us more complete picture.
Okay, so identity is the bridge. What does it actually consist of, according to this source?
Well, it breaks identity down into two really crucial interwoven aspects. First up, there's what it calls personal identity.
Personal identity, okay.
This is basically what developmental psychology often means by identity. It's one's own theory of who one is.
My theory of me.
Exactly. More precisely, it's defined as an explicit theory of yourself as a person, that is, as a singular and continuous rational agent, extending from the past through the future and acting on the basis of beliefs and values that you see as defining who you are.
Okay, singular, continuous, rational agent, acting on beliefs and values. That sounds pretty deep.
It is, and it has deep roots, like in Erik Erikson's work on ego identity, that whole adolescent who am I struggle.
Yeah.
But the foundations, they start way, way earlier in childhood.
So it's not just like a list of traits I have, like I'm tall or I like pizza. It's more active.
Yeah.
An internal story I'm telling myself about myself.
You've absolutely nailed it. It's an active internal narrative we construct. Like if you see yourself as, say, a creative person or someone who's always fair,
Yeah, okay.
that's your personal identity guiding your choices, shaping how you act. It's subjective. It's your story inside your head. And this is key, it's always bumping up against reality.
How so?
Well, let's say you strongly identify as an honest person. That's core to your story. But maybe you find yourself, I don't know, fudging the truth sometimes, cutting corners.
Yeah.
That gap, that discrepancy between your self-story, I'm honest, and your actual behavior, I just lied, creates this internal pressure. It's uncomfortable.
Yeah. Cognitive dissonance, right.
Exactly. So you've got pressure to either change your behavior to match your identity, start being more honest, or if the behavior keeps happening, you might eventually have to rewrite your identity story to fit the actions. Maybe you start thinking, well, I'm mostly honest, or honesty depends on the situation.
Wow. And thinking about kids, for an elementary teacher, You'd see this playing out all the time, wouldn't you?
Absolutely. You're watching children literally form these first theories of self. A kid might confidently say, I am a helpful person, or I'm good at sharing.
Yeah, they declare it.
They do. And as a teacher, you see their actions either line up with that or create tension. When a child who sees themselves as helpful struggles to share a favorite toy, that's a live moment.
A teaching moment.
A huge teaching moment. You can guide them to reflect on that gap. I know you want to be helpful, and sharing is part of being helpful. How can we make this work? You're helping them practice the behavior that matches the positive identity they're trying to build. You're helping them write and refine their own story.
Okay, that makes so much sense. Our internal narrative, our theory of me. But like you said, we don't live in a vacuum. We're social creatures. Our sense of self must also be tied up with groups, right? The use part.
It absolutely is. And that brings us right to the second crucial aspect, social identity.
Social identity, okay.
This covers those parts of our identity that involve our connections to other people, and especially our connections to groups.
Like my family, my friends?
Yes, but also, importantly, more abstract groups. Think nations, cultures, religions, political affiliations, even things like being a fan of a certain sports team.
Right, things bigger than just me and my immediate circle.
Exactly, and the significance here is huge. These abstract groups, they often have a kind of permanence. They outlast the individuals in them.
Yeah, a country exists long before I'm born and long after I'm gone.
Precisely. So affiliating with these groups gives us this deepened sense of, well, continuity, permanence, even meaning. We become part of something larger, something that lasts. And because of that, we get highly motivated to act on behalf of the groups that are central to our social identities.
So that can be good, like volunteering for a cause I believe in because I identify with that group.
Absolutely. It can drive incredibly positive, constructive action, working together for a common good. But it can also drive deeply destructive actions, as we'll unfortunately see.
Right. It's powerful either way.
Immensely powerful. And the source uses this great analogy. You know the Greek myth of Scylla and Charybdis, the sea monsters you have to navigate between?
Yes, steer the narrow path.
Right. So the source says we need to do that with social identity. Avoid two extremes. On one side, Scylla is seeing social identity as only a part of personal identity. It's too psychological. It makes it seem like individuals just invent groups out of thin air. On the other side, Charybdis is seeing social identity as just being molded by the group. Too sociological, it makes individuals seem like passive puppets of the collective.
So the truth is somewhere in the middle.
It's about the connection. A dialectical conception, the source calls it, connecting the psychological reality of our personal stories with the sociological reality of the groups we belong to. Neither one alone fully explains why we do what we do, especially together. Identity is that crucial bridge. It links the individual mind to collective action.
Okay, so back to the classroom example. Personal identity is I am good at drawing. Social identity is I am part of the second grade class, or I'm on the red team for field day. They're different, but both give meaning.
Exactly. Different kinds of meaning, but equally powerful. As kids grow, they naturally start connecting with groups beyond their family. They get excited about it. I'm a member of the green team for our reading challenge, or we're the second graders, we stick together.
Yeah, that sense of belonging.
It's huge. It provides belonging, meaning, and it shapes their behavior within that group. You might see a kid acting more responsibly because they're proud to be one of the morning helpers, or maybe they read more because they identify with the reading club.
And teachers can foster that positive group feeling.
Absolutely. Teachers play a massive role in fostering positive group identities, creating a classroom community, a sense of shared purpose. Building that collective we in a healthy way can be incredibly empowering for kids.
So it's this interplay. Who I think I am inside my personal story and who I am in relation to these groups, big and small. That really does set the stage for understanding, well, how things can go right, but also how they can go very, very wrong.
It's the foundation.
And speaking of wrong, here's where it gets really interesting and frankly a bit unsettling. The source material dives into David Moshman's four-phase model of genocide.
Yeah, this is the core framework.
Now, let me just reiterate this because it's important. The examples are extreme. We're talking Holocaust, Rwanda, heavy stuff. But the processes he describes, the psychological steps, they are universal. They're human patterns.
They can appear in milder forms anywhere.
Exactly, in any social setting, including potentially your future classroom, which is why understanding them, even though the examples are intense, is just so critical, especially if you're going to be working with kids, shaping how they see each other and the world.
It's about recognizing the seeds before they grow into something terrible.
Right. So identity, as we said, is the link between individual psychology and these big group actions. And the model lays out 4 phases, often overlapping, that tend to precede and accompany this kind of destruction. What are they?
Okay, the 4 phases are dichotomization, dehumanization, destruction, and denial.
Dichotomization, dehumanization, destruction, denial. Okay.
And like you said, they're not always neat, separate steps. They often bleed into each other, feed off each other. But they represent a recognizable and terrifying pattern in group violence.
Let's take the first one then. Phase 1. Dichotomization of identities.
All right. So the source explains that normally, in a kind of healthy state, people define themselves through lots of different connections, multiple affiliations, ethnic, religious, political, maybe job-related hobbies, interests.
We wear many hats.
Exactly. We form unique personal identities, but we also have these overlapping social identities. We're part of many groups at once. It might be, say, a teacher, a parent, a fan of a certain band, someone who likes hiking. Lots of things. The typical state of society involves this complex web of overlapping identities. People can connect in lots of different ways.
Okay, that's the normal state. Complexity.
Yes. The shift happens with dichotomization. This is when certain dimensions of identity become supercharged, really salient is the word the source uses, so prominent, so overriding that all the other dimensions just fade into the background. They become peripheral, unimportant.
So one identity marker overshadows everything else.
Precisely. People start getting defined and defining others based on just one or maybe 2 things. And in the most extreme form, one single dimension gets highlighted above all others. And then that dimension gets radically simplified into just 2 categories.
Us and them.
Us and them. Black and white. No gray areas, no nuance, no overlap allowed. The middle ground disappears.
So instead of being, say, a kid who loves art and plays soccer and is kind to animals, you just become an art kid, and someone else is just a soccer kid. And that label becomes the only thing that seems to matter. That's the danger.
That's the core danger. The source emphasizes that complexity in identity is a safeguard. When our multifaceted, messy, overlapping identities get forcefully squeezed into a simple us versus them, that's when the groundwork for serious division gets laid. It's a fundamental narrowing of human connection.
And the source gives historical examples of this.
Yes, powerful ones. Think about the European conquest of the Americas, starting back in 1492. You have these 2 incredibly different societies suddenly colliding. The cultural gap was just immense.
Right.
So potential cross-group connections, like maybe solidarity between European women and indigenous women based on shared gender experiences, were initially just inconceivable, the source says. Europeans mostly saw indigenous women as just female Indians, not as fellow women. That huge cultural divide immediately created and reinforced an us versus them dynamic. Finding common ground beyond that single overwhelming distinction, European versus indigenous, was incredibly hard.
That initial contact itself created a dichotomy.
It did. And another really stark example is the 1994 genocide in Rwanda. Before colonialism, the distinction between Hutu and Tutsi was actually pretty fluid. It was based more on things like ancestry and socioeconomic status, like how many cattle you owned.
It's not like rigid tribes.
Not at all. They weren't separate tribes living in different areas. They lived together, shared language, beliefs, they intermarried. Rwandans had genuinely multifaceted identities. Being Hutu or Tutsi might matter in some situations, but not others. It wasn't the defining feature all the time.
But then colonialism changed things.
Drastically. European rule from the late 1800s into the 1960s basically solidified the distinction. They introduced mandatory identity cards that explicitly labeled people as Hutu or Tutsi.
Wow, they literally put it on paper. Officially dichotomized them.
They officially dichotomized the population. Then, after independence, things intensified. You had the rise of the Hutu power movement, which aggressively defined Rwanda as purely a Hutu nation, painting Tutsi people as dangerous outsiders, as aliens. They used radio constantly, systematically, to hammer home these anti-Tutsi divisive messages.
Propaganda fueling the fire.
Relentlessly. And the middle ground just vanished. Moderate Hutu leaders who argued for an inclusive Rwanda were attacked, demonized by extremists on both sides, actually. Their efforts were undermined. Tutsi extremists fueled Hutu power fears, and Hutu power rejected any shared future. It led to this complete violent split, Hutu power supporters versus everyone else.
And even moderate Hutu were targeted.
Tragically, yes. Thousands of moderate Hutu were killed for betraying their Hutu identity, for not conforming to the extreme us versus them. And then over 500,000 Tutsi were systematically murdered, often identified purely by those colonial-era identity cards, in just 100 days. It's just a chilling, devastating example of how a once fluid distinction was manipulated and hardened into an absolute deadly dichotomy.
That's incredibly powerful and horrifying. And it makes you think, okay, obviously not on that scale, but in a classroom, you see the beginnings of this, don't you? Kids forming cliques, our group versus the other kids. The basic psychology feels familiar.
It absolutely is. The scale, the consequences are worlds apart, thankfully. But the fundamental psychological process, that in-group, out-group thing, it's the same basic human tendency. A teacher might see it when kids exclude someone from a game or form really tight social circles that shut others out.
And sometimes maybe teachers even contribute to it without meaning to.
It's possible. If a teacher constantly uses rigid labels or groups kids in fixed ways that don't allow for change or overlap, it can subtly reinforce those us versus them lines. Think about maybe always pitting boys against girls in competitions. Done repeatedly, it might unintentionally make gender the main way kids see each other, potentially overshadowing other connections or friendships.
So the teacher's role is to actively promote that complexity, the multifaceted identities idea.
Exactly. Consciously push back against simplification. Emphasize that a child can be many things. You're a great reader, and you're a kind friend, and you're learning soccer. Highlighting multiple aspects prevents one label from sticking and defining them.
And creating activities that mix kids up.
Yes. Intentionally design activities where kids from different reading groups or usual friend circles have to work together, mixed group projects, cooperative games, anything that builds connections across those typical lines. It helps kids see each other as complex individuals, not just members of that other group. It's about building bridges, fostering that messy, complex web of relationships rather than letting walls form.
Okay, so phase one is dichotomization, splitting the world into a rigid is and them. What comes next?
Once that division is firmly established, once we are clearly separate from them, it sadly opens the door to the next, really disturbing psychological step. Phase two, dehumanization of the other.
Dehumanization, making them seem less than human.
Precisely. Having set them apart, we're now psychologically positioned to dehumanize them. And the source makes a startling point. Dehumanization is actually an everyday social phenomenon. We see mild forms all the time. But radical dichotomization enables much more radical and systematic forms.
How does it define it?
It's about removing the other from what the source calls the universe of moral concern, basically pushing them outside the realm of moral obligation. They're seen not just as different from us, that was dichotomization, but as less worthy than us, or in extreme cases, not human at all.
And the impact of that? It's chilling. It lets people do things they'd never dream of doing to someone they see as a fellow human being.
That's exactly it. It psychologically prepares people to do things to others that we would never do to those we see as people. It's like it bypasses our normal empathy, our conscience.
And the source gives examples of the kinds of labels used.
Yeah, and it's a shocking list, but important to hear. Across history, targets have been called things like weeds, rats, vermin, dogs, wolves, cows, monkeys, viruses, maggots, microbes, parasites, plague, pests, snakes, spiders, lice, locusts, cockroaches, cancerous cells, or malignant tumors.
Wow. All non-human, often pests or diseases.
Exactly. Or, less biologically, labels like heretics, heathens, infidels, barbarians, savages, subversives, or terrorists. Whatever the specific label, the function is the same. To portray the target group as not part of the human universe of persons, not deserving of human rights, outside our moral consideration, they become just an obstacle, a contamination, a threat to be dealt with.
And the examples? Like in Rwanda.
In Rwanda, the Hutu power movement relentlessly spread the idea of the Tutsi as cockroaches. They were framed as this collective infestation, distinct from humanity, lacking individuality. So killing a Tutsi wasn't seen as murdering a person. It was framed as simply decreasing the number of cockroaches, eliminating a threat. That required a massive psychological effort not to see their humanity.
And the Holocaust.
Franz Stangl, the commandant of the Treblinka death camp, described the arriving Jews in 1942-43 as cattle, a mindless herd. Their bodies were just garbage. He explicitly said he rarely saw them as individuals, just a huge mass. That complete reduction of people to disposable cargo is the absolute endpoint of dehumanization.
That's horrifying.
We see it again in the Latin American dirty wars, Argentina, Guatemala, El Salvador in the 70s and 80s. Victims weren't people, they were labeled subversives. An Argentinian general literally said it wasn't people that disappeared, but subversives. In Guatemala, Mayans targeted in massacres were called deer to be hunted. Entire villages, including children, were deemed part of a subversive village, not made up of individual humans.
Even children.
Even children. And going way back, the source mentions the philosopher John Locke arguing in the 17th century that rebellious natives in the Americas could be destroyed as a lion or tiger, one of those wild, savage beasts. And 19th century settlers calling Apaches wolves that needed to be exterminated. It's truly disturbing how similar the dehumanizing language is across centuries and continents. It points to a deep, dark pattern in human group conflict.
It really does. But you said dehumanization is an everyday social phenomenon. That's a crucial link for our listener, maybe trying to connect these awful historical examples to something more familiar. How does that play out on the smaller scale?
Oh, absolutely. Think about a school playground or even online interactions. When someone calls another person a crybaby, a nerd, a loser, a thug, a snowflake, a bully, what are they doing?
Reducing them to one negative thing.
Exactly. They're taking a whole complex person and slapping a single negative label on them. It strips away their individuality, their multifaceted identity we talked about, and it makes it easier for others to dismiss their feelings, to exclude them, to be unkind. Why? Because you're not seeing a person anymore. You're seeing a crybaby, a nerd, a caricature. It's a micro version of the same fundamental process. The core insight here is that dehumanization erodes empathy. Reducing someone to a label makes it easier to ignore their humanity.
So when a teacher steps in on name-calling, it's not just about politeness. It's actually pushing back against this process at its root, building a kind of moral muscle.
It's absolutely fundamental. Actively challenging name-calling, challenging those derogatory labels in the classroom, it's crucial. You're not just correcting bad behavior, you're cultivating a moral imagination. Teaching kids to see the full humanity in everyone, even when they disagree or someone makes a mistake, is foundational.
How do you do that, practically?
You guide them to think about the other person's perspective. How do you think that label made them feel? What else do you know about that person besides this one thing? Could there be a reason they acted that way? It helps them understand that labels shrink people down, make it easier to hurt them. You keep reinforcing. Everyone here is a whole person with feelings deserving respect. You're teaching them to look beyond the label to the complex human being underneath. It builds that basic respect for dignity.
Okay, so phase 1, dichotomization, us versus them. Phase 2, dehumanization. They're less than human. What's phase 3?
Phase 3 is destruction of the other. This is where the psychological groundwork laid by the first two phases can lead to horrific action.
The physical violence.
Yes. Now, the source is clear. Dichotomization and dehumanization are necessary preconditions for genocide, but they aren't sufficient, meaning just because these things happen doesn't automatically guarantee genocide will follow. There are no known cases of genocide without radical dichotomization and dehumanization happening first. Together, they set the conditions for violence.
But it's not inevitable.
No. Whether things actually escalate to genocide is incredibly complex. It depends on a whole mix of interacting forces, psychological, sociological, economic, political, cultural, historical, legal stuff. No single theory can perfectly predict if or when it will tip over into mass destruction.
Okay.
But the key point is, if genocide does happen, it follows these preparatory phases. Without that psychological and social setup, narrowing identities, stripping away humanity, the kind of widespread, systematic destruction seen in genocide becomes almost impossible to organize or justify in the minds of perpetrators.
So phase 3 is the terrifying outcome, the physical acting out of the first two phases. Understanding those earlier steps, how identities get narrowed, how humanity gets denied, is absolutely crucial for understanding how such horror becomes possible and maybe how to prevent it.
Precisely. Because once the other is conceptually removed from the moral universe, physical destruction becomes, in the minds of those doing it, possible, justifiable, even necessary.
Which leads us to the last phase, which you said might be the most insidious.
Yes, phase 4, denial to preserve moral identity. And denial, the source points out, doesn't just start after the destruction, it often begins before and during.
How so?
Well, dehumanization itself is a form of denial, isn't it? It denies the human reality of the victims, making the violence seem less like murder. But denial continues powerfully long after the act of violence stops.
Why? What's its purpose?
Its core purpose is to let perpetrators, and often their descendants or the societies they belong to, avoid acknowledging what we have done. Why? To preserve their subjective moral identity.
Their image of themselves as good people.
Exactly. It taps into this deep, widely shared human need to see ourselves individually and collectively as fundamentally moral agents. Most people don't see themselves as evil regardless of what they've done. We maintain this positive self-image partly by trying to act well, yes, but also by denying, rationalizing, or forgetting our worst actions. The key insight. Denial is the mind's shield against guilt. It lets individuals and groups keep feeling good about themselves even after doing terrible things.
It's like a psychological defense mechanism. I'm a good person, so I couldn't have done that. Or if I did, it wasn't so bad. Or I had reasons. Or it wasn't really me.
You've got it. And the source lists several common ways denial works, often overlapping. First, just refusing to acknowledge the facts. Flat out ignoring evidence that contradicts the preferred story. Second, declining to investigate. Deliberately staying ignorant about things you don't want to know. Don't ask, don't tell. Yeah. Third, selective memory. Remembering only the facts that support your view, conveniently forgetting the ones that don't. Fourth, playing with definitions. Maybe manipulating the definition of genocide so your group's actions don't quite fit while readily applying it to your enemies. Fifth, insisting we had no choice. Framing atrocities as unavoidable reactions to circumstances. And sixth, biased education. Teaching children only one side of the story, ensuring they see the rightness of our cause and the wrongness of theirs, embedding the denial for the next generation.
Wow, that's a whole toolkit for avoiding truth. Examples.
Think about Argentina's dirty war again in the late 70s. Around 30,000 people disappeared, kidnapped, tortured, killed by the military government. The official stance. The government claimed to know nothing. They suggested victims ran off to join subversive groups or became prostitutes, children born in prison or kidnapped with parents. Officially, they had never existed. They might admit some people were missing, but denied that any specific group or social identity had been targeted. Total denial to protect their image and avoid accountability.
Just erase them from the record.
Effectively. Or consider the U.S. involvement in the Central American Dirty Wars, arming and training forces that committed atrocities. The source argues that in the U.S. today, there's basically no longer any debate as to whether U.S. involvement was morally justified. The matter is simply never discussed. It calls this total denial within mainstream media, education, politics, an absence of discussion that functions as powerful denial.
Ignoring it is denying it.
Yes. Then there's Operation Reinhard during the Holocaust. The Nazis declared the extermination camps top secret. Afterward, they systematically demolished the camps. Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka dug up hundreds of thousands of bodies from mass graves and burned them. Why? Explicitly to maximize future deniability and protect German moral identity. They even put small farms on the sites to try and completely erase the history.
Unbelievable efforts to hide the truth.
And on a massive ongoing scale, the source points to the nations of the Americas, including the U.S. and Canada, remaining virtually oblivious to the fact that their founding involved a series of genocides that eliminated hundreds of targeted indigenous cultural groups. This denial isn't usually explicit. It manifests as framing history as progress, replacing barbarian cultures with civilization, or invoking manifest destiny. Because, as the source bluntly puts it, no one wants to identify with a nation founded in genocide. Protecting that patriotic national identity makes acknowledging the full truth incredibly difficult, even unacceptable.
That connection to national identity, to the stories nations tell themselves, that's huge. And again, thinking about education, you can see denial playing out in much simpler ways with kids, can't you? It really feels like a basic human thing.
Oh, absolutely. You see it constantly in a classroom. A child misbehaves and instantly says, "I didn't do it." Or they rationalize, well, he started it, or everyone else was talking to. What are they doing?
Protecting themselves.
Yeah.
Trying to stay the good kid.
Exactly. They're trying to preserve their moral self-conception, keep seeing themselves as good kids, despite what they did. Or maybe a group of kids is mean to someone, and later they all agree, we were just joking, or it wasn't really bullying. They collectively deny responsibility to protect their group identity as nice kids.
So when a teacher guides kids to take responsibility, to own up to mistakes, it's actually teaching them to push back against this ingrained denial tendency.
It's foundational work, guiding students to take responsibility, acknowledge their part, understand the impact of their actions. It builds the bedrock for truth-telling and accountability. It directly counters that pervasive human urge to deny uncomfortable truths. It teaches them that acknowledging mistakes, even when it's hard, is part of being a responsible moral person and part of building a community based on trust, not avoidance. It builds real integrity.
Okay, so these four phases, dichotomization, dehumanization, destruction, denial, form a powerful pattern.
Eh,
But you said earlier, the source notes, these aren't just about genocide. They're general to group violence, which takes many forms.
that's right. The analysis doesn't stop at genocide. It shows how these same identity processes fuel other kinds of group violence, which often overlap anyway. First, let's just refine the idea of genocide itself slightly.
Okay.
The source suggests genocide isn't just about mass killing, it's the destruction of something more. A social identity. And the best way to see this clearly, it argues, is to look at a case where the goal was cultural destruction, mostly separate from physical killing.
And that brings us to that really poignant example. The Indian boarding schools in the U.S. and Canada. No intended physical killing, but a clear aim to destroy cultures.
Exactly. From the late 1800s into the mid-1900s, the governments ran these schools for indigenous children. The explicit goal: to eliminate indigenous cultures by severing the link between generations and assimilating the children. The idea was the cultures themselves would die out, even if the people survived physically.
How did they do it?
The methods were a systematic assault on identity. Kids taken from families, given English names, traditional haircut, forbidden to speak their languages, often punished harshly if they did. Forced to learn English, Christianity, middle-class values, their own histories erased, replaced with the story of progress of civilization. The infamous motto captures it perfectly: kill the Indian, save the man. What was being killed? The social identity connecting them to their ancestors, their culture, their past. The source argues that while it wasn't a death camp, it's morally blind not to see the similarity in the fundamental goal: the destruction of a social identity.
That example just hits so hard. It really drives home how vital cultural identity is to a person's whole sense of self. For anyone in education, understanding this history makes affirming diverse backgrounds in the classroom feel less like a nice extra and more like a fundamental ethical responsibility.
It truly does. Any attack on a child's cultural identity, even if subtle or unintentional, can be deeply harmful. Knowing this history helps educators create genuinely inclusive spaces where every child's background, language, and identity are valued and seen as strengths, not things to be erased or ignored. It's about letting every child feel whole and respected.
Okay, so that's redefining genocide around identity destruction. What other forms of violence fit the pattern?
Well, there's ethnic cleansing. The goal here is to eliminate some group from some place. Genocide, eliminating a group from the world, is its most extreme form. A key example given is the 1948 ethnic cleansing of Palestine.
How did the processes play out there?
First, dichotomization. Zionist ideology had often portrayed Palestine as a land without a people for a people without a land. This narrative effectively erased the existing Palestinian population, who were actually 2/3 of the people and owned most of the cultivated land. The UN partition plan in 1948 then created a radical on-the-ground dichotomy. Then, destruction. Plan Dalet, launched by Zionist leaders and paramilitary forces, systematically emptied and destroyed hundreds of Palestinian villages, forcing out or terrifying about 700,000 people. Massacres happened, encouraging the exodus. And then, denial. This started immediately. The standard Israeli narrative became one of David fighting Goliath, a story taught for decades. The source argues that official denial continues, refusing to acknowledge the reality of 1948 or the Palestinian right of return, often dehumanizing victims as obstacles or threats.
Dichotomization, destruction, denial. It fits the pattern. What about terrorism? How does identity work there, especially for the perpetrators?
With terrorism, the source highlights that perpetrators almost always identify strongly with their own group. They see themselves acting on behalf of that group for what they believe are legitimate purposes. Critically, they usually see their actions as morally okay, maybe even admirable or even obligatory.
They believe they're doing the right thing.
From their perspective, yes. The source looks at two starkly different examples. First, the September 11th attacks. Al-Qaeda and bin Laden saw themselves acting for Islam against perceived ongoing violence and humiliation by the U.S. and its allies. The targets Pentagon, World Trade Center were symbols of American military and economic power. From Al-Qaeda's viewpoint, the attacks were morally praiseworthy, a defense or retaliation.
Okay. And the second example, you mentioned it was provocative.
It is. The source suggests the deadliest day of terrorism in history was August 6, 1945, the U.S. atomic bombing of Hiroshima. It killed maybe 100,000 people that day. While some call it genocide, the source argues its primary intent was to terrorize them, the Japanese leadership and population, into submission, fitting a definition of terrorism.
And the justification and denial.
The U.S. had justifications, of course. At war, Pearl Harbor, saving lives by ending the war quicker, doing what had to be done. The source makes the crucial point. Perpetrators of terrorism always have justifications to maintain their moral identity. They often feel they're under attack or acting preemptively that violence is necessary for justice or peace. And denial operates universally, blinding us all, the source says, to our responsibility for deadly violence. It notes how Americans rarely think about the thousands of child victims in Hiroshima and never as individual people. Dichotomization and dehumanization make the killing possible to frame acceptably, and denial keeps it safely in the past, unexamined.
Dichotomization, dehumanization, denial again. It's sobering how consistently that pattern applies. The source also briefly links torture, disappearances, and mass killing to these same processes.
Yes, quickly but importantly, torture. Clear dichotomization. Torturer versus tortured. Victims often dehumanized, subversives, terrorists, to justify it, usually done in secret. Often uses linguistic denial, like calling it interrogation or enhanced interrogation, to sanitize it. Disappearances, like Argentina or U.S. black sites, aims to eliminate political groups, terrorize others, and critically permit denial of responsibility because there's no body, no clear perpetrator. Mass killing targets specific groups, dichotomization, requires ongoing dehumanization to make it seem less than murder, always followed by powerful denial. The big takeaway, these aren't separate issues. They're different branches of the same tree, rooted in these fundamental identity processes.
Okay, this is heavy stuff. But if these processes are so common, so deeply rooted in human identity itself, what can we actually do? If the problem isn't just bad people, but something about how groups and identities work generally, is there any hope? What are the strategies for pushing back?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And thankfully, the source doesn't just leave us with the problem. It offers pathways forward, strategies grounded in understanding these very processes. It emphasizes that the most fundamental challenge underlying all this is the question: who counts as a person?
Who gets included in our circle of moral concern?
Exactly. That question is tangled up with politics, religion, ideology, and identity. And the answer has life or death consequences. Those who don't count as persons fall outside that universe of moral obligation, making them vulnerable. So the strategies aim to expand that universe, or at least prevent it from shrinking. The source suggests we can reduce group violence substantially and sometimes prevent it from escalating.
Okay, what's strategy number 1?
Strategy 1, resist dichotomization. First, we have to accept that in-group, out-group feelings are always going to be there. It's part of having a social identity. It's human. The goal isn't to somehow eliminate groups or group feelings. That's impossible and probably not even good.
Right. Belonging is important.
It is. So the goal is to maintain multiple connections, multiple affiliations, and overlapping groups. It's about actively promoting and protecting complexity. Helping ourselves and others see the many ways we connect, the many identities we hold. The source calls it trying to tame the wild beast of identity.
Keep it complex, keep the connections varied.
Exactly. But there's a caution here. Be careful not to recreate dichotomization in the process. For example, just labeling opponents as extremists can itself be dehumanizing, painting them as beyond reason, potentially justifying harsh measures against them. It's a tricky balance. We need to foster complexity and connection, resisting those simple binary divides wherever we see them forming.
This feels incredibly relevant for teachers again, encouraging kids to have those multifaceted identities we talked about. That is resisting dichotomization at the ground level, isn't it? Building resilience against those divisive forces. Can you paint a picture of a teacher actively doing this?
Sure. Let's say a classroom naturally starts dividing into maybe the sporty kids and the artsy kids. They hang out separately, maybe make fun of each other a bit. A subtle dichotomy forms.
Yeah, happens all the time.
So a teacher resisting this might intentionally create a project that requires both artistic skill and physical coordination. Maybe designing and building something for the playground. They'd form mixed groups, putting sporty and artsy kids together, needing each other's skills.
Forcing the overlap.
Forcing the overlap, demonstrating shared goals. Or maybe the teacher makes a point of celebrating all kinds of achievements publicly. Look at this amazing drawing Maya did, and wow, Leo, you were so fast in the race today, and Sarah, I saw you helping Sam when he fell down. That was so kind. You're constantly reminding them, explicitly and implicitly, that people are complex, that they can be good at different things, that kindness matters across all groups. You're actively pushing back against the idea that one label defines anyone. You're showing them we're all more than just one thing.
Okay, resist dichotomization. What's strategy 2?
Strategy 2. Challenge dehumanization. This goes beyond just telling people to use careful language or avoid slurs. though that's important. It requires a deeper argumentation and reconceptualization. We need to actively work to change how we fundamentally think about others, especially those we disagree with or fear. It's about actively rehumanizing them in our minds and our conversations.
So when that kid calls another kid a nerd or whatever, it's not just saying don't use that word. It's about challenging the thinking behind the word. How does that sound in practice?
Exactly. You use it as a moment to teach empathy and perspective taking, the direct antidotes to dehumanization. You might say, okay, you use the word nerd. What does that word mean to you? Does it describe everything about that person? Think about them. What are some cool or interesting things you know about them? How do you think it feels to be called just that one thing?
Getting them to see the whole person again.
Yeah. Yes. Help them see that labels flatten people, make it easier to be mean or exclude them. Keep reinforcing that everyone in the classroom, everyone we meet, is a whole, complex person with feelings deserving respect, even if we don't always understand them or agree with them. You're training them to look past the easy label to the real human being underneath, building that fundamental respect for dignity.
Makes sense. Resist dichotomization, challenge dehumanization. What's the third strategy?
Strategy 3, identify and challenge denial. This one's tough because denial is so pervasive and invisible, as the source says. It's often deeply baked into our personal stories, our group narratives, our national myths. Even when historians dig up the facts and debunk the myths, the denial often persists.
Because the truth is uncomfortable or threatens our identity.
Precisely. So the crucial action here, the source argues, is simple but hard. Determine and teach the truth.
Confronting the denial head-on with facts.
Yes. It points again to the denial around the 1948 ethnic cleansing of Palestine, which continues despite historical evidence, or how nations in the Americas remain largely oblivious to their genocidal foundations because the needs of patriotic national identity make the truth unacceptable. We prefer the comforting story. This is a huge challenge, especially when denial is tied to identities we cherish.
That is a huge challenge. How do you even start tackling that in a classroom with young kids? You can't just dump horrifying historical truths on them, but you also don't want to perpetuate denial.
It's about building the foundations for truth-telling and critical thinking. It starts with fostering that classroom culture of honesty and accountability we talked about earlier. When kids argue, you guide them to truthfully acknowledge their own part, even if it's embarrassing. That builds the basic moral muscle for facing uncomfortable realities.
Okay, personal accountability first.
Yes. And then, as they get older, you teach them to evaluate information critically. Where did this story come from? Is there another side to this? Could this source be biased? When learning history, even simplified versions, you make sure to include the perspectives of all groups involved, not just the winners or the dominant narrative. You gently introduce the idea that history is complex, sometimes painful, and that understanding it fully means looking at it from different angles. You're not necessarily teaching the hardest truths immediately, but you're building the skills and the disposition to confront them later, rather than just accepting comforting myths. It's showing them that facing truth, not denying it, is how we learn and grow.
So resist dichotomization, challenge dehumanization, identify and challenge denial. These three actions, taken together, can significantly reduce group violence and maybe even stop it from escalating.
That's the argument. It's a call to conscious action, grounded in understanding these deep psychological and social patterns.
It's a powerful framework, and it leads to what feels like the source's most profound, maybe surprising, final point. This idea about the ordinary nature of it all.
Yes, it really brings it home. The single most important conclusion from decades of research on genocide, the source states, is that these extreme horrors are all too common. And maybe more shocking. They are, for the most part, the work of ordinary men and women playing social roles in groups, institutions, and practices central to their identities.
Not monsters.
Ordinary people.
Ordinary people caught up in extraordinary destructive social processes. The analysis suggests genocide isn't the result of some rare, monstrous evil, but the potential outcome of ordinary identities and ubiquitous psychological and social processes of dichotomization, dehumanization, and denial.
So the focus shouldn't be on figuring out how they, the perpetrators, are different from us, the good people. Exactly. That's the wrong question, the source implies. The harder, more critical question is why we all turn so often to group violence and support the violence of our own groups. The problem isn't located in some specific bad identity. It lies in the general nature of identity itself. As long as we have social identities, which, the source says, is as long as we remain human, then we will remain prone to group violence.
Wow, that's incredibly sobering. prone to it just by virtue of being human and belonging to groups.
It is sobering, but like you said before, it's also strangely empowering. It removes the US versus them at the level of basic human potential. It makes it a shared human challenge, not someone else's problem.
And it means we can do something. We can manage that potential.
Precisely. Even if we can't eliminate the potential entirely, understanding these processes helps us reduce it substantially and sometimes prevent it from escalating. We know what to watch out for. We know the warning signs in ourselves and in our societies. We know, at minimum, these three things. We should be wary of efforts to divide us from others. We should resist dehumanization of others, and we should identify and challenge denials of the truth. These aren't just intellectual points, they are active daily practices, commitments.
And for you, listening, maybe that elementary education major, understanding this isn't just academic. It's about seeing these fundamental human dynamics playing out in miniature every day in the interactions of children. It's about consciously building classrooms that foster empathy, critical thinking, inclusion, responsibility. It's about guiding these powerful identity forces towards connection and understanding, not division and harm. It's about laying the foundation for a better world, literally one classroom, one child at a time. So this deep dive has taken us through some dark territory, identity, division, violence, denial. But it's also given us a map, hasn't it? A way to understand these powerful, ordinary human processes of dichotomization, dehumanization, and denial. And more importantly, it's given us strategies for resistance. Actively fight division, challenge dehumanizing labels wherever you see them, and demand truth, even when it's uncomfortable.
Knowledge is a form of power, hopefully.
Exactly. So here's a final thought for you to take away, to mull over. Given how pervasive these processes really are, how might recognizing them in your own daily life, the small stuff, maybe how you talk about different departments at work, or the dynamics in a community meeting, or even just playground squabbles, how might recognizing them empower you to be a more conscious force for good? How can you start right where you are, in your community, maybe in that future classroom? What's just one small step you could commit to today to maybe foster a more complex identity in someone or gently challenge a subtle act of dehumanization you witness?
Something concrete to think about.
Yeah, something concrete. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it gave you some powerful insights and maybe a renewed sense of purpose in navigating the complexities of human identity and group life.